The town of Ridgecrest, California, sits at the edge of nothing. Desert in every direction, sky so wide it makes people feel small on purpose. The kind of place where ambition goes to dry out and die unless someone is stubborn enough to water it with sweat and blood, and the kind of fury that only grows in girls who are told no before they even ask the question. Rachel Calter was that kind of stubborn. She was born in 1989 to a mother who cleaned motel rooms off Highway 178 and a father who had been a Marine for 11 years before a roadside bomb in Iraq sent him home, missing his left leg below the knee and most of his ability to sleep through the night. He never talked about the war. He talked about discipline. He talked about honor. He talked about the fact that the world would chew you up and swallow you whole if you did not learn how to hit back harder than it hit you. He said these things while sitting on the porch in his wheelchair, staring at the mountains like they owed him something. Rachel listened, not because she was obedient. She was not obedient. She was feral in the way desert children sometimes are, running through scrub brush barefoot, catching lizards, fighting boys twice her size in the schoolyard, and not caring whether she won or lost as long as she made them bleed a little. She listened because her father was the only person in her life who never looked at her like she was fragile. Everyone else did. Her teachers, her mother, the neighbors, the church ladies who brought casseroles and pity in equal portions after her father's accident. They all looked at Rachel like she was something to protect, something soft, something that would eventually settle down and marry a boy from town and work at the gas station or the diner or the motel like every other girl who grew up on the edge of nothing. Her father looked at her like she was a weapon that had not yet been sharpened. She loved him for that. Loved him in the desperate, chest-cracking way that children love parents who see them clearly. And when he died, when she was 14, when the painkillers he had been prescribed for his phantom limb finally caught up with the darkness he carried in his head, and he swallowed enough to stop everything, she did not cry at the funeral. She stood at the edge of his grave in a dress her mother had borrowed from a neighbor because they could not afford to buy one, and she made a decision that rearranged the architecture of her entire life. She was going to become a Navy SEAL, not a soldier, not a sailor, not a support role or a desk job, or any of the paths the military offered women at that time. She wanted the thing they said women could not have. The thing they said women's bodies were not built for, women's minds were not wired for, women's hearts were not hard enough to survive. She wanted it specifically because they said she could not have it, and she wanted it because her father had once told her in one of his rare moments of something close to tenderness that the SEALs were the best, the absolute best, and Rachel Calter did not see the point in being anything less. She told her mother that night after the funeral. Her mother was sitting at the kitchen table, still in her black dress, drinking coffee that had gone cold 2 hours ago, staring at the wall the way Rachel's father used to stare at the mountains. "I'm going to be a Navy SEAL," Rachel said. Her mother did not laugh. That would have been easier to handle. Instead, she just looked at Rachel with an expression that held so much exhaustion and so much grief and so much love all tangled together that it was impossible to separate one from the other. "Baby," she said, "they do not let women do that." "They will," Rachel said. She was 14 years old. She weighed 98 pounds. She had knuckles that were still scabbed from a fight with Danny Pruitt behind the gymnasium. And she said it with the kind of certainty that does not come from confidence. It comes from having nothing left to lose. The next 4 years were a war fought in silence. Rachel ran every morning before school. 5 miles, then 6, then 8, then 10. She ran in the heat that made the asphalt shimmer and buckle. She ran in the cold desert mornings when frost clung to the sagebrush. She did push-ups in her bedroom until her arms shook so badly she could not hold a pencil in first period. She did pull-ups on the bar her father had installed in the garage doorway years ago, back when his arms still worked and his mind still believed in mornings. She did sit-ups until her abdominal muscles cramped so hard she had to lie on the bathroom floor and breathe through it like labor. She read everything. Every book about the SEALs she could find at the public library, which was not many, and then every book she could find online at the school computer lab, printing pages when the librarian was not looking because she could not afford ink at home. She studied the training pipeline. She memorized the phases. Bud/S, Hell Week, the pool competency test, the 4-mile timed run, the obstacle course. She knew the dropout rates. She knew that 75% of candidates quit. She knew that the ones who survived were not always the strongest or the fastest. They were the ones who refused to ring the bell. She was not going to ring the bell. Her high school years passed in a blur of monotony and determination. She had no friends, not because she was unlikable, but because she had no time for the things that friendship required at that age, the parties and the gossip and the slow, sprawling afternoons of doing nothing. She worked at the gas station on weekends to help her mother with rent. She trained every other waking hour. She graduated with decent grades and a body that had been rebuilt from the inside out, lean and hard and capable of things that made the boys in gym class stare. She enlisted in the Navy the week after graduation. Her mother drove her to the recruiting office in their rusted Chevy pickup, the one that smelled like motor oil and had a cracked windshield they could not afford to fix. They did not talk during the drive. When Rachel got out of the truck, her mother grabbed her wrist. "Your father would be proud," she said. Rachel nodded. She did not trust herself to speak. She walked into the recruiting office and signed her name, and that was that. Boot camp was easy. Not physically easy. Physically, it was brutal in all the ways she had expected. But it was easy in the sense that she had been training for this for 4 years, while everyone else had been training for 8 weeks. She finished first in her class in the physical fitness test. She finished second in marksmanship. She finished first in the swim test by a margin that made her instructors look at each other. She requested a path towards special operations. Her commanding officer, a lieutenant named Hendricks, who had the kind of mustache that looked like it had been issued by the military along with his uniform, sat her down in his office. "Coulter," he said, "you know women are not currently permitted to serve in direct combat roles." "I know, sir." "Then you know that the SEAL pipeline is not open to you." "Not yet, sir." He studied her. She held his gaze. She had learned a long time ago that the most powerful thing a woman could do in a room full of men was simply refuse to look away. "What exactly is your plan?" he asked. "My plan is to be so good that when they open the door, I'm the first one through it." He did not laugh. He did not dismiss her. Something moved behind his eyes, something that might have been respect or might have been recognition. The look of a man who has seen enough of the world to know that the ones who speak like this are either delusional or dangerous, and the dangerous ones are worth watching. "I will put you on the path," he said, "but the path is going to hurt." "Good," Rachel said, and it did. It hurt in ways she had not imagined, and in ways she had imagined, and in ways that fell somewhere in between the two, in that gray territory where pain becomes so constant that it stops being pain and starts being just the texture of your life. She was assigned to support roles that kept her adjacent to special operations. She trained with men who did not want her there. She endured comments that ranged from dismissive to cruel to sexually explicit, and she filed every single one away in the part of her brain that she used for fuel. She did not complain. She did not report. She performed. She outperformed. She became the kind of quiet, relentless force that makes people uncomfortable because they cannot figure out where the engine is. In 2015, the Department of Defense opened all combat roles to women. Rachel heard the news on a Tuesday afternoon. She was in the middle of a 10-mile ruck march with 60 pounds on her back, and sand in her boots, and sweat running into her eyes. A fellow sailor jogged up beside her and said, "Hey, Coulter, they just opened the SEALs to women." She did not stop marching. She did not celebrate. She adjusted the straps on her pack and said, "Good." The application process was a gauntlet of paperwork and evaluation and scrutiny that would have crushed anyone who was doing this for the wrong reasons. Rachel was doing this for the right reasons, or at least the only reasons she had, which are the same thing as far as she was concerned. She passed every screening. She met every physical standard. She submitted her application to attend BUD/S, Basic Underwater Demolition/SEAL training, and she waited. The waiting was the hardest part, harder than the running. Harder than the cold. Harder than the men who stared at her like she had walked into their church wearing the wrong skin. The waiting sat in her stomach like a stone, heavy and cold and immovable, and she dealt with it the way she dealt with everything, by training harder, by running farther, by doing one more push-up than she thought she could do, and then one more after that. When the acceptance came, she read it 3 times. Then she folded the letter and put it in the pocket of her father's old field jacket, the one she had kept all these years, the one that still smelled faintly of gun oil, and something else, something that was just him. And she pressed her hand against the pocket and stood there for a long time in the barracks hallway, not moving, not speaking, just feeling the weight of the paper against her chest. Bud/S was everything the books said it would be, and everything the books could not say. The books could describe the cold water, and the log carries, and the surf torture, and the endless runs in boots full of sand. The books could not describe the particular quality of exhaustion that sets in around day 3 of Hell Week, when the body has burned through every reserve of energy it has and starts consuming itself, starts eating muscle for fuel, and the mind begins to play tricks that are not tricks at all, but honest confessions from the deepest part of the brain, the part that says this is not worth it, the part that says the bell is right there, the part that says just ring it and you can sleep. Rachel did not ring it. She almost did. Once. At 2 in the morning on the 4th night of Hell Week. She was standing chest deep in the Pacific Ocean with 5 other candidates, arms linked, waves crashing over their heads, water temperature somewhere around 58 degrees, which does not sound cold until you have been standing in it for 45 minutes, and your body has stopped shivering because shivering requires energy, and you have none left. The instructor was on the beach, megaphone in hand, saying the same thing instructors have been saying for decades. You can quit anytime. The bell is right there. Hot coffee, warm blankets. This can all be over. She looked at the bell. It was maybe 50 yards away. Brass. Ordinary. The most powerful object in the world at that moment, because it represented the end of pain, and pain was the only thing she had been feeling for 96 hours straight. She looked at it, and she thought about her father. Not the man in the wheelchair. The man before. The man in the photographs her mother kept in a shoebox under the bed. The man in desert camouflage with a grin that split his face in half. The man who had believed that strength was the only inheritance worth leaving. She turned away from the bell. The man next to her, a guy named Torres who had played linebacker at Annapolis and outweighed her by 110 pounds, was crying. Not sobbing. Just leaking tears that mixed with the salt water on his face in a way that made them invisible unless you were standing close enough to see. He looked at Rachel, and she looked at him, and neither of them said anything. They just locked arms tighter and waited for the next wave. Torres rang the bell the next morning. Rachel did not. She graduated BUD/S. She completed the advanced training. She earned the Trident. She became one of the first women to complete the full SEAL pipeline, and when they pinned the eagle and anchor insignia on her chest, she felt her father's field jacket in her locker like a ghost pressing its hand against her back. The media wanted to turn her into a symbol. She refused every interview. She declined every feature. She did not want to be the woman who became a SEAL. She wanted to be a SEAL. The distinction mattered to her in a way that she could not articulate and did not try to, because the act of explaining it would have diminished it, would have turned something she had earned with her body and her mind and for years of running in the desert into a talking point, a headline, a feel-good segment between the weather and the sports. She was assigned to SEAL Team 3. She deployed. She operated. She did the work. And then, 18 months into her career as an operator, she was sent to a joint military base in the Middle East for a combined training exercise with coalition forces. And that is where she met General Arthur Raines. And that is where everything she had built collided with everything she had been running from. And the collision made a sound that echoed across an entire military base and eventually across the world. General Arthur Raines was 61 years old. A 3-star general with a career that spanned 4 decades and 3 wars and a reputation that depended entirely on who you asked. If you asked his superiors, he was a decorated officer with a distinguished record of service. If you asked his peers, he was competent and politically savvy and knew how to survive in the bureaucracy. If you asked the men and women who had served under him, the answer got quieter and more complicated. They would look at their hands or their boots or somewhere past your shoulder, and they would say things like strict or old school or demanding, and the pauses between those words carried more information than the words themselves. Rains came from old military money. His father had been a colonel. His grandfather had been a brigadier general. He had grown up in a house in Virginia where the walls were covered with framed commissions, and the dinner table conversation was conducted like a briefing. He had been taught, from the time he could walk, that authority was not something you earned. It was something you inherited like a surname or a jawline, and it was your job to maintain it, to project it, to make it so visible and so constant that no one in your vicinity ever forgot who was in charge. He had opinions about women in combat. He expressed these opinions freely in staff meetings and at dinner parties and in official memos that were always carefully worded enough to avoid formal reprimand, but never carefully worded enough to hide what he actually meant. He believed that the integration of women into combat roles was a political decision, not a tactical one. He believed it weakened unit cohesion. He believed it introduced variables that did not need to be introduced. He said standards a lot. He said readiness a lot. He said the mission so frequently that it had become a kind of verbal shield, a phrase he could hold up anytime someone accused him of being what he was. When he learned that a female SEAL would be participating in the joint training exercise at his base, he made his displeasure known through the usual channels. He mentioned it to his aide. He mentioned it to the base commander. He mentioned it to anyone who would listen, and even some who would not, that he considered the presence of a female SEAL operator to be a distraction, an experiment, and a risk to the serious work that needed to be done. Rachel arrived at the base on a Wednesday morning in August, stepping off a C-130 in a heat that hit her like opening an oven door. She had her gear on her back and her trident on her chest, and the particular kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst thing you can imagine and knowing that everything after that is just weather. She knew about Rains. Everyone knew about Rains. The military is a small world, and gossip travels through it faster than orders. She had been briefed by her team leader, a senior chief named Walsh who had the weathered face of a man who had been squinting into the sun for 20 years. Rains is old guard, Walsh told her before she deployed. He has been trying to block women from combat roles since before you were born. He is not going to make this easy. I do not need it to be easy, Rachel said. Walsh looked at her the way people who have seen combat look at people who are about to see something different, but equally dangerous. I know you do not, he said. Just keep your head down and your performance up. Let the work speak. She intended to do exactly that. The base was a sprawl of concrete and dust, temporary structures baking under a sun that seemed personally offended by the existence of shade. Coalition forces from 6 different countries were there. American, British, French, Australian, Jordanian, and Saudi. The joint exercise was supposed to build interoperability, which was a word that meant learning to work together and was usually achieved through a combination of shared training, shared meals, and shared complaints about the heat. Rachel settled into her quarters, stowed her gear, and reported for the initial briefing. The room was full of operators and officers from every participating country, maybe 300 people in total, and she was one of 4 women in the entire room. The other 3 were support staff. She was the only one wearing a trident. She felt the eyes. She always felt the eyes. She had felt them in boot camp and in BUD/S and on every deployment and in every briefing room and every mess hall and every helicopter and every mission. The eyes that measured her, evaluated her, doubted her, desired her, dismissed her, resented her, or simply tried to figure out what she was doing there. She had stopped caring about the eyes a long time ago. Caring about the eyes was a luxury she could not afford, like sleep or self-pity or the belief that the world would ever be fair. The briefing was conducted by the base commander, a colonel named Davis who was efficient and professional and clearly uncomfortable with the political dynamics swirling beneath the surface of this exercise. He laid out the training schedule. He explained the rules of engagement for the simulated operations. He introduced the senior officers from each participating nation. General Rains was introduced last. He stood and walked to the front of the room with the deliberate, unhurried stride of a man who had never been told to move faster in his life. He was tall and lean and had the kind of face that looked like it had been carved from something expensive. Silver hair, cut short. Blue eyes that held the particular shade of cold that some men cultivate as a substitute for depth. He wore his stars like they were part of his skeleton. He spoke for 10 minutes about the importance of the exercise, about the standards expected, about the need for professionalism and rigor. He spoke well. He had the polished delivery of a man who had been giving speeches his entire career, the kind of delivery that sounds like leadership if you're not listening carefully, and sounds like performance if you are. Rachel listened carefully. At one point during his remarks, his gaze swept across the room and landed on her. On her trident. His eyes stayed there for exactly 2 seconds, and in those 2 seconds, something moved across his face that was too fast and too controlled for most people to catch. Rachel caught it. She had spent her entire life reading the faces of men who did not want her where she was. It was contempt, clean and bright and completely undisguised for those 2 seconds before his expression smoothed back into the polished mask of command. She met his gaze, held it, did not look away. He moved on. The first 3 days of the exercise passed without incident. Rachel trained. She performed. She did what she always did, which was the work, all of the work, nothing but the work performed at a level that left no room for criticism and no space for doubt. She completed every evolution. She led her fire team through every simulated scenario. She shot better than most of the men on the range and moved through the kill house with the kind of fluid, economical violence that comes from thousands of hours of practice until the body knows what to do before the mind finishes deciding. Her teammates treated her like a teammate. They had worked with her. They knew what she could do. Whatever reservations any of them had held when she first joined the team had been erased by shared suffering and shared excellence, the two things that actually build trust in special operations. The coalition partners were a mixed bag. The British and Australian operators were professional and accepting. The French were polite and slightly flirtatious in a way that seemed more cultural than personal. The Jordanians were respectful and curious. The Saudi contingent kept their distance, which Rachel understood without taking offense. And General Rains watched. He attended briefings. He observed training evolutions. He stood at the edge of the range with his aide beside him and his hands clasped behind his back, watching Rachel through eyes that had already decided what she was and were simply looking for evidence to confirm it. On the 4th day, he found what he was looking for, or rather, he manufactured it. The morning evolution was a joint assault exercise, a simulated compound raid involving mixed teams from 3 countries. Rachel's fire team was assigned the breach role, the first ones through the door, the tip of the spear. It was the most dangerous position and the most prestigious, and it had been assigned to them based on their performance scores from the previous 3 days. The exercise went flawlessly. Rachel's team breached the compound, cleared 4 rooms in under 90 seconds, neutralized all simulated targets, and secured the objective with 0 friendly casualties. It was textbook. It was better than textbook. It was the kind of performance that instructors record and use for training purposes. The after-action review was conducted in an open courtyard, the way these things sometimes are in forward operating bases, with troops gathered in formation and the reviewing officers standing on a slightly raised platform. It was hot. The sun was directly overhead. 300 soldiers and operators stood in ranks, sweating through their uniforms, waiting for the debrief. General Rains took the platform. He reviewed the exercise. He praised certain units. He noted areas for improvement. He was thorough and articulate and everything a 3-star general should be during a professional debrief. Then he paused. The pause lasted 3 seconds. Rachel counted them because she had learned that when powerful men pause, what comes next is rarely good. I want to address something, he said. His voice carried across the courtyard without effort. There's been a great deal of attention paid to certain participants in this exercise. Media attention, political attention, the kind of attention that has nothing to do with combat readiness, and everything to do with social experiments being conducted at the expense of our fighting force. He did not look at Rachel. He did not need to. Every person in that courtyard knew who he was talking about. Rachel stood in the second row of her formation. She kept her eyes forward. She kept her breathing steady. She felt the familiar weight of 300 gazes shifting toward her like heat-seeking missiles acquiring target. And she did what she had always done with that weight. She carried it. Rains continued. I have served in this military for 40 years. I have seen fads come and go. I have seen political agendas dressed up as progress. And I have seen the consequences when we prioritize optics over operational effectiveness. His aide, a major named Holt who had the look of a man who had been watching his boss walk toward a cliff for years and had given up trying to stop him, shifted his weight. It was a small movement. Rachel noticed it. The standards of this military exist for a reason, Rains said. And I will not stand by while those standards are diluted to accommodate agendas that have no place in a combat zone. He stopped. The silence in the courtyard was the kind that has texture, thick and heavy and full of the things no one is saying. Rachel could hear the flag snapping in the wind above the command building. She could hear the distant rumble of a generator. She could hear her own heartbeat, steady and slow, the heartbeat of a woman who had been standing in chest-deep water at 2 a.m. and had chosen not to ring the bell. The formation was dismissed. Soldiers began to disperse. Rachel turned to move with her team. Petty officer called her. His voice. Behind her. Close. She turned. General Rains was standing 5 feet away. His aide was beside him. Several dozen soldiers were still in the vicinity, some moving, some watching, all within earshot. Sir, she said. He looked at her the way a man looks at something he has stepped in. That was quite a performance this morning, he said. Thank you, sir. I was not complimenting you. His voice was measured, but carried the kind of edge that comes from decades of having every word obeyed. I was observing that your team carried you through that exercise. The breach was executed by your teammates. You followed. This was a lie. It was a specific, deliberate, verifiable lie. Rachel had been first through the door. It was on video. Every person on her team and every observer knew it. Rains knew it. He was saying it anyway because he could, because his stars gave him the right to reshape reality, and in 40 years, no one had ever told him otherwise. Rachel felt something shift inside her. Not anger. Not yet. Something older. The feeling of being 14 and standing at the edge of a grave while church ladies looked at her with pity. The feeling of being told no before she asked the question. Sir, she said. Her voice was even. Controlled. The voice of a woman who had been trained to maintain composure under conditions that would break most people. I was first through the breach point. The after-action footage will confirm that. Are you contradicting me, petty officer? The question was not a question. It was a trap with jaws and teeth and the full weight of military hierarchy behind it. To say yes was insubordination. To say no was to accept a lie. Rachel stood on the edge of a moment that had been building since she was 14 years old, since her father died, since she decided to become the thing they said she could not be. The courtyard was not empty. People were watching. People were always watching. She chose her words with the precision of someone setting a charge. I'm stating a fact, sir. The temperature between them dropped 20 degrees. Rains took one step closer, close enough that she could see the broken capillaries in his nose, the kind that come from years of drinking that a man in his position never has to answer for. Close enough that his shadow fell across her face. You are a publicity stunt, he said. His voice was low now, meant for her, but carrying in the desert air the way voices do. You are a box that someone in Washington needed to check. And when this experiment fails, and it will, You will be the reason good men doubt the readiness of their own military." Rachel said nothing. She stood there. She absorbed it. She held it. And then General Arthur Raines, 3-star general, 40 years of service, decorated officer, did the thing that ended his career and began hers in a way she never wanted and could not control. He raised his hand and struck her across the face. Open palm, full force, in front of every soldier who had not yet left the courtyard. The sound was sharp and flat and enormous in the silence that followed. It echoed off the concrete walls. It rang in the still air. It hung there, suspended, while every person within 50 yards stopped moving and stopped breathing and stopped existing as anything other than a witness. Rachel's head snapped to the side. She tasted copper. She felt the heat bloom across her cheek, spreading like a burn. She felt her pens, the tactical pens she kept in her chest pocket, shift and threaten to fall. And for one bizarre, fractured second, that was the thing she focused on. The pens. Her pens were going to fall. The pens did not fall. She turned her head back to face him, blood on her lip where her teeth had cut the inside of her mouth. Eyes clear, hands still at her sides. The courtyard was a hell breath. And then Rachel did something that was not in any training manual and was not in any regulation and was not in any of the books she had read about the SEALs. She did the thing that her body knew how to do because her body had been trained for violence the way a pianist's hands are trained for keys, and the training does not ask permission from a mind. She moved one step, one shift of weight, one rotation of the hips that generated force from the ground up through the legs, through the core, through the shoulder, through the arm, and into the heel of her palm, which connected with General Arthur Raines's sternum with the kind of clean, mechanical precision that sends a man 6 inches taller and 80 pounds heavier straight to the ground. He hit the concrete. Hard. The sound his back made was a sound that 300 witnesses would later describe in 300 different ways, but the most common description was like dropping a sandbag off a truck. Rachel stood over him, blood on her lip, chest rising and falling with breathing that was steady and measured and absolutely terrifying in its calm. "I am a Navy SEAL," she said, not shouting, not whispering, speaking at exactly the volume required for every person in that courtyard to hear. "And you just made the worst mistake of your career." The courtyard held its breath for 3 more seconds. Then the chaos began. The chaos had a shape to it, the way a car crash has a shape if you slow it down enough to see the physics. Bodies moving in every direction. Voices colliding in 3 different languages. The particular kind of frozen panic that happens when the chain of command breaks in front of the people who depend on it to hold. Major Holt reached Raines first. He knelt beside the general the way you kneel beside something that has already stopped being what it was, with the slow recognition that you are now managing wreckage. Raines was on his back, eyes wide, mouth opening and closing like a man who has forgotten how to operate his own face. He was not injured in any serious physical way. The strike had knocked the wind out of him and dropped him, but the real damage was the kind that does not show on x-rays. The real damage was 300 witnesses and the particular sound a 3-star general makes when his authority hits concrete at the same speed as his spine. 2 military police officers materialized from somewhere in the crowd, moving with the urgent confusion of men who had been trained for this scenario in a classroom and never expected to encounter it in a courtyard with a general on the ground and a woman with a trident standing over him. They approached Rachel from both sides, hands on their sidearms, but not drawing because the situation did not fit any of their training models. A subordinate striking a superior officer was one thing. A female SEAL putting a 3-star general on the ground after he slapped her in front of witnesses was something else entirely, something that existed in a gray zone that their manuals did not cover. "Ma'am," one of them said. He was young, maybe 22. His voice cracked on the second syllable. "Ma'am, I need you to step back." Rachel stepped back. Her hands were at her sides, open, visible. She was cooperating not because she was afraid, but because she understood what was coming next, and she understood that every second from this point forward was being recorded, if not by cameras then, by the memories of 300 people who had just watched the most astonishing thing they had ever seen on a military installation. She was taken to the MP station, not in handcuffs. Nobody made a decision about handcuffs because nobody could figure out who was the aggressor and who was the victim and whether those categories even applied in a situation where a general had struck a woman and the woman had responded with the kind of force they teach you in SEAL training. She was placed in a room with a metal table and 2 chairs and a fluorescent light that hummed at a frequency designed to make every human emotion feel slightly worse. She sat down. She folded her hands on the table. She noticed the blood on her lip had dried, and she could feel it pulling at the skin when she moved her mouth. She did not wipe it off. She did not ask for water. She did not ask for a lawyer. She sat there with the stillness of a person who has survived Hell Week and knows that anything with a roof and a chair is not the worst place she has ever been. Her team leader, Senior Chief Walsh, was outside the door within 20 minutes. She could hear him through the wall, his voice carrying the kind of controlled fury that experienced operators use when they cannot afford to yell. He was on the phone with someone. Then, he was on the phone with someone else. Then, he was in the hallway arguing with the MP commander about access and legal representation and the fact that one of his people had been assaulted by a general officer in front of 300 witnesses and was now sitting in an interrogation room like she was the criminal. Walsh was a good man. The kind of man who had been doing this long enough to know that good men do not always win, but they always fight, and the fighting matters even when the winning does not. The door opened. Walsh came in. He sat across from her and looked at her face, at the mark on her cheek that had already started to bruise, a smudge of purple spreading across skin that was still tan from the desert sun. "You good?" he said. "I am fine. You hit a 3-star general. He hit me first." Walsh rubbed his face with both hands, the gesture of a man who is trying to physically push exhaustion out of his skull. "I know he did. Everyone knows he did. Coulter, do you understand what is about to happen?" "Yes. Tell me what you think is about to happen." "They're going to try to bury me." Walsh looked at her for a long time. Then he nodded, not because he agreed with the outcome, but because he respected that she could see it clearly. She had always been able to see things clearly. It was one of the things that made her exceptional as an operator and terrible as a politician, and the next few weeks were going to require more politics than she had ever encountered in her life. "I've already called SOCOM Legal," Walsh said. "I have spoken with our commanding officer. Everyone who was in that courtyard is being identified, and their statements are being collected. The video from the base security cameras is being preserved. He is going to say I attacked him," Rachel said. "Probably. He is going to say I was insubordinate, and he was maintaining discipline. Almost certainly. And half the brass is going to believe him because he has stars, and I have ovaries." Walsh did not flinch at this. He had served with Rachel long enough to know that her bluntness was not bitterness. It was tactical assessment. She was reading the battlefield the same way she read every battlefield, by identifying threats, calculating distances, and figuring out which way the bullets were going to come from. "The other half is going to believe you," Walsh said, "because they saw it, or because someone they trust saw it, and because the video exists, and because you're not the first person Raines has done this to. You're just the first person who hit back." That last sentence landed in the room like something heavy dropped from a height. Rachel looked at Walsh. Walsh looked at the table. "What do you mean?" she said. "I mean that Arthur Raines has a history. The kind of history that powerful men accumulate over 40 years when nobody stops them. Verbal abuse. Physical intimidation. There are rumors of worse. Nothing on his record, because nothing ever makes it to his record. People complain, and the complaints disappear. People transfer, and the transfers are filed as routine. People leave the military, and the reasons they cite are personal, always personal, never the 3-star general who treated them like something he scraped off his boot." Rachel absorbed this. She absorbed it the way she absorbed cold water and long runs and the weight of 300 gazes. She put it in the place inside her where fuel was stored, and she let it burn. "So what do we do?" she said. "We do what SEALs do," Walsh said. "We operate. The next 72 hours were a war fought in offices and conference rooms and over encrypted phone lines, and it was nothing like the wars Rachel had been trained for, but it was just as vicious. General Rains was taken to the base medical facility, where he was examined and declared physically unharmed. The bruise to his sternum was minor. The bruise to his ego was catastrophic. He filed a formal complaint within 4 hours of the incident, charging Petty Officer Rachel Coulter with assault on a superior officer, insubordination, and conduct unbecoming. The charges were serious. Assault on a superior officer under the Uniform Code of Military Justice carried a maximum sentence of 10 years in a military prison, dishonorable discharge, and forfeiture of all pay and allowances. It was the kind of charge that ended careers and erased people, that turned decorated operators into cautionary tales whispered in barracks hallways. Rachel read the charges in the same room where she had been sitting for 6 hours. She read them the way she read after-action reports, with attention and distance and no visible emotional response. Then she put the paper down and looked at the JAG officer who had been assigned to her case, a lieutenant commander named Sarah Chun who had the sharp eyes and pressed uniform of someone who had graduated top of her class at Georgetown Law and had chosen military justice because she believed in the system and was increasingly discovering reasons to question that belief. "Is this everything?" Rachel asked. Chun looked at her. "This is everything he is charging you with, yes. What about what he did? That is more complicated. It should not be. You are correct. It should not be. But General Rains has already given his statement to the investigating officer, and his version of events differs substantially from what the witnesses are reporting." "What is his version?" Chun opened a folder. She had the look of a woman who was about to read something that offended her professional soul. "His statement says that you were insubordinate during the after-action review, that you challenged his authority in front of coalition partners, that when he approached you afterward to counsel you privately, you became aggressive and physically threatening, and he was forced to restrain you with an open-hand correction. He says your subsequent strike was unprovoked and constituted assault." Rachel stared at her. The fluorescent light hummed. Outside, the desert went about its business of being dry and hot and indifferent. "An open-hand correction," Rachel repeated. "Those are his words. He slapped me across the face in front of 300 people because I told him I was first through the breach point, which I was, and he is calling a correction." "Yes." Rachel laughed. It was not a happy laugh. It was the kind of laugh that happens when the absurdity of a situation exceeds the capacity for anger, when the only honest response to a lie that enormous is the involuntary recognition that you're dealing with someone who has been lying so long they have forgotten that truth exists as a separate category. 300 witnesses, Rachel said. In base security footage, Chun said, which I have already requested be preserved and which I am told is being reviewed by the base commander's office. Good. But I need to be clear with you about something, Petty Officer Coulter. Chun closed the folder and set it aside and looked at Rachel the way a surgeon looks at a patient before explaining the operation. Even with witnesses, even with footage, even with the fact that he struck you first. You struck a 3-star general in the United States military. That is not a minor thing. There are people above both of us who are going to want this to go away quietly. There are people who are going to want you to accept a reduced charge, take a discharge, and disappear. They're going to frame it as mercy. They're going to frame it as the best deal you will get. And they're going to apply pressure from every direction they can to make you take it. "I'm not taking it," Rachel said. "I know you're not. I just needed to hear you say it." The investigation that followed was both thorough and political, the way all military investigations are when the subject is a general officer, and the accuser is a woman, and the media is circling like sharks who have smelled blood in bureaucratic water. Because the incident had occurred in front of hundreds of coalition personnel from multiple nations, it could not be contained. It cannot be buried. It cannot be filed under personal and forgotten. Within 48 hours of the incident, someone who had been in that courtyard told someone who was not, and that someone told a journalist, and the journalist published a story with a headline that made the rounds of every major news outlet in the English-speaking world. Rachel did not read the coverage. Chin advised her not to, and she agreed, not because she was afraid of what it said, but because she did not have the bandwidth to manage other people's narratives while she was trying to survive her own. She had her statement. She had her truth. She had the bruise on her face that was photographed and documented and entered into evidence by a military physician who had the grim efficiency of someone who has done this before and wished she had not. The witness statements came in over the following days, and they painted a picture so consistent and so damning that anyone reading them could reconstruct the incident in real time, beat by beat, word by word, slap to strike to concrete. 300 people had seen the same thing. Their accounts varied in the details the way eyewitness accounts always do. Some said the slap was with the right hand, some said the left, some said Rachel's response was a palm strike, some said it was a punch, but on the essential facts on the sequence and the provocation and the aggression they agreed. Rain struck first. Rain struck a subordinate. Rain struck a woman. And that woman struck back. The politics above Rachel's pay grade moved in ways she could not see and could only sense the way you sense a current underwater by the pole. Her commanding officer called Walsh. Walsh called Chun. Chun called Rachel. "They are offering you a deal," Chun said. It was day 5. Rachel was still on the base, still in administrative limbo, still training with her team because no one had officially ordered her to stop, and Walsh had made it clear that she would not stop until someone did. What deal? No charges. Clean discharge. Honorable, but with a recommendation that you not seek reactivation. They will characterize it as a mutual altercation. Both parties agreed to separate. No court-martial. No record. And Rains? He retires. Full benefits. The incident is classified as an interpersonal conflict during a training exercise. Rachel was sitting on the edge of her rack in her quarters. Her boots were unlaced. She had just come back from a 12-mile run in body armor. Her shirt was dark with sweat. Her hair was tied back in a braid that had come loose on the left side, and she kept tucking it behind her ear, the same strand, over and over, a gesture that she was not aware of, but that anyone watching would have recognized as the physical expression of a mind working through something it does not want to work through. "They want to call it mutual," she said. "Yes." He slapped me in front of 300 people. I defended myself, and they want to call it mutual. "Yes." "No." Chun was silent for a moment. Then she said, "I was hoping you would say that." "Why?" "Because I have found 7 other complaints against Rains. 7, spanning 23 years. 2 were physical altercations with subordinates. 1 involved a female officer who reported that Rains shoved her during a disagreement and was told by her commanding officer to let it go. Another involved a junior enlisted man who Rains struck during a training exercise in 2004 and who was subsequently transferred to a different command and left the military 6 months later." Rachel stopped tucking her hair. "Where did you find these?" I asked the right questions to the right people. Some of them were waiting for someone to ask. Some of them have been waiting for years. The silence that followed was the kind that changes rooms. It was the silence of something shifting, not in the conversation, but in the story, the larger story that had started long before Rachel Coulter was born and would continue long after this moment, and all its participants had been forgotten. It was the silence of a pattern becoming visible for the first time, like stars that were always there, but could only be seen once someone pointed out the constellation. "They're willing to talk?" Rachel asked. 2 of them are willing to make formal statements. The others want to remain anonymous, but will provide documentation. Medical records, transfer requests, personal journals. If this goes to court-martial, all of that comes out. "Yes." "And if I take the deal, it stays buried." "Yes." Rachel looked at her boots. They were scuffed and worn and perfectly broken in, the kind of boots that have been to enough places to have opinions about the ground. She looked at them for a long time. "I'm not taking the deal," she said again. The formal investigation escalated. Chun filed a countercharge against General Rains on behalf of Rachel, charging him with assault, conduct unbecoming an officer, and abuse of authority. She also filed a request for an expanded investigation into his conduct history, citing the 7 prior complaints. The military legal system moved the way all large systems move when confronted with something they would rather not deal with the grinding reluctance of machinery being forced to process material it was not designed for. But it moved, slowly and painfully and with friction at every joint, but it moved because the evidence was too clear and the witnesses were too many and the video was too definitive and the media attention was too intense for even the most determined bureaucratic inertia to overcome. Raines hired a civilian attorney, a man named David Marsh who specialized in defending high-ranking military officers and had the expensive suits and careful haircut of someone whose entire career was built on making powerful men's problems disappear. Marsh immediately went on the offensive, issuing statements through unofficial channels that characterized Rachel as an unstable individual with a history of aggression, that questioned the validity of her SEAL qualification, that suggested she had been promoted through the pipeline as a political gesture rather than on merit. None of these claims were true. All of them found an audience. Rachel's teammates responded the way SEALs respond when one of their own is attacked, with the cold, professional fury of people who consider loyalty a combat skill. Senior Chief Walsh gave a statement to the investigating officer that was so precise and so devastating in its detail that it read less like a witness account and more like an after-action report of a leadership failure. He described Raines's speech. He described the approach. He described the slap. He described Rachel's response. He described his own observations of Raines's demeanor throughout the exercise, the way he had watched her, the way he had spoken about her, the pattern of behavior that was visible to anyone who had been trained to read threat indicators. Other teammates gave similar statements. The picture they painted was not just of a single incident, but of a pattern that was Raines's life work, the slow accumulation of authority wielded as a weapon against anyone who threatened his vision of what the military should be. The court-martial was scheduled for October. It would be a general court-martial, the most serious type, because of Raines's rank and the nature of the charges. It would be held at a military installation in Virginia, which was Raines's home territory, which was either a coincidence or not, depending on how much faith you had in coincidences. Rachel flew back to the United States. She was placed on administrative duty pending the trial, which meant she sat at a desk and pushed paper and attended meetings that had nothing to do with the work she had spent her entire life preparing to do. She handled this the way she handled everything else, by running. 10 miles every morning, 15 on weekends. She ran until the frustration burned out of her and left behind something cleaner, something that was not quite peace, but was at least the absence of the particular kind of fury that comes from being punished for surviving. Her mother called. They had not spoken much since Rachel joined the military, not because of any falling out, but because Rachel had never been good at the soft maintenance that relationships require, and her mother had learned to accept silence as a form of love. "I saw the news," her mother said. "Mom, I saw the news, Rachel. I saw what he did, and I saw what you did." Silence on the line. The kind of silence that spans 14 years, and a funeral, and a decision made at the edge of a grave. "Your father," her mother said. She stopped, started again. "Your father had a commanding officer once. Before Iraq. He never talked about it. But I found a letter he wrote. After he died. In his things. It was addressed to someone in the military, someone I did not know. The letter described things that were done to him. By a superior. Things that he never reported because he was afraid of what it would do to his career." Rachel sat on the floor of her apartment. She had been standing when the call started, but somewhere during her mother's words or legs had made a decision that her mind had not yet caught up with. "He never sent it," her mother said. "The letter. It was still sealed. The floor was cold." Rachel pressed her palms flat against it. She could feel the grain of the wood through her skin, each tiny ridge and valley, the geography of surface that had nothing to do with anything and was the only thing she could focus on without breaking apart. "Why are you telling me this now?" Rachel asked. "Because you did what he could not. And I need you to know that what you did was not just about you." Rachel pressed her palms harder into the floor. "I know, Mom. I am proud of you. I was always proud of you." even when I was scared for you, even when I did not understand. I know. Do not let them bury this. I will not. They hung up. Rachel sat on the floor for another 40 minutes. She did not move. She did not cry. She pressed her palms into the wood and felt the grain and counted the ridges and let the two currents run through her. The one on the surface that was a woman sitting on a floor in an apartment in Virginia, and the one underneath that was a girl standing at the edge of a grave deciding to become something impossible. The media attention intensified as the court-martial date approached. Rachel continued to refuse interviews. Chun handled all communication with the press, issuing statements that were brief and factual and devoid of the emotional manipulation that characterized Marsh's PR campaign on behalf of Raines. The contrast was deliberate. Chun understood, as all good lawyers do, that the most powerful argument is the one that does not need to shout. But the public narrative was taking shape regardless of Rachel's silence, and the shape it was taking was complicated. She was being called a hero by some and a problem by others. She was being held up as proof that women belong in combat by people who had never been in combat, and torn down as proof that they do not by people who had never met her. She was a symbol, a mascot, a cautionary tale, a triumph, a disaster, depending on which channel you watched and which website you read and which version of the story served your existing beliefs. Rachel hated all of it. She hated it with a specific, focused intensity that she kept locked in the same place. She kept her anger in the box labeled useful fuel. She had not asked to be a symbol. She had asked to be a seal. The distinction was the same one it had always been, the one she could not articulate and did not try to, because articulating it would have required her to engage with the narrative machine, and engaging with the narrative machine would have required her to stop being what she was and start being what they wanted her to be. She was not going to do that. She was going to sit in a courtroom and tell the truth and let the truth do what truth does when it is given a chance, which is burn through everything that is not itself. The preliminary hearings began in September. Chun and Marsh faced each other across a military courtroom that smelled like floor wax and had the particular atmosphere of rooms where people's lives are decided by other people in uniforms. The judge was a military officer, a colonel named Barbara Price, who had a reputation for being fair and unflappable, and who had once, according to military legal lore, stared down a two-star general who tried to influence a verdict and told him to leave her courtroom or be held in contempt. Rachel liked that story. She did not know if it was true. She liked it anyway. The preliminary hearings established the facts. The video was entered into evidence. It was grainy, shot from a security camera mounted on the roof of the command building, but it showed everything. It showed Raines approaching Rachel. It showed the conversation. It showed the slap. It showed Rachel's response. It showed Raines hitting the ground. The timestamp was visible. The distance was measurable. The physics were undeniable. Marsh tried to have the video excluded on technical grounds. Price denied the motion. Marsh tried to argue that Rachel's SEAL training constituted a weapon, and that her response was therefore disproportionate force. This argument had a certain legal logic to it, but it also required the court to accept the premise that a woman defending herself against a physical assault from a superior officer was obligated to calibrate her response based on her training level, which meant accepting the premise that she should have stood there and taken it, which meant accepting the premise that a general had the right to hit her. Price did not accept this premise. She let the argument be made for the record. Then she moved on. The 7 prior complaints against Raines were submitted by Chun as evidence of a pattern of behavior. Marsh objected. Price allowed them under the military rules of evidence as relevant to the question of whether Raines's conduct was an isolated incident or part of an ongoing pattern of abuse of authority. 2 of the 7 complainants had agreed to testify. The first was a retired Army captain named Thomas Brewer, who had served under Raines in 2008. Brewer was 53 years old, had a beard and a quiet manner, and the particular kind of composure that belongs to men who have processed their anger into something else over the course of decades. He described an incident in which Raines had shoved him during a disagreement about logistics planning, hard enough to send him into a wall, in front of junior enlisted personnel. He had reported the incident. The report had been routed through Raines's command. The report had disappeared. The second was a retired Navy lieutenant named Jessica Torres, no relation to the Torres who had wept beside Rachel in the ocean during Hell Week. Torres was 41, had left the military in 2014, and had spent the intervening years building a career in civilian life that was successful and stable and marked by the particular kind of relentless competence that sometimes belongs to people who are trying to prove something to a ghost. She described an incident in 2012 in which Raines, then a 2-star, had cornered her in an office and berated her for 20 minutes about a supply requisition error, culminating in his grabbing her arm hard enough to leave bruises. She had photographed the bruises. She had reported the incident through her chain of command. She had been transferred to a different unit within a week. The transfer was filed as her request. It was not her request. Torres cried on the stand. Not the kind of crying that is designed for effect. The kind that comes from the body without permission, that leaks out of the eyes while the voice stays steady, and the words keep coming, the kind that is the physical expression of years of carrying something alone and, finally, being asked to set it down in a room full of strangers. Rachel watched from the gallery. She watched Torres cry, and she felt the two currents inside her. The surface current that was a woman in a uniform sitting in a courtroom watching a legal proceeding, and the subterranean current that was connected to every woman and every man who had ever been hit by someone with more power and been told that the hitting was their fault. The preliminary hearings concluded. The general court-martial was confirmed. General Arthur Raines would stand trial for assault, conduct unbecoming an officer, and abuse of authority. Petty Officer Rachel Coulter would stand trial for assault on a superior officer. Both trials would proceed simultaneously because the military justice system recognized that the two incidents were inseparable, that you could not judge Rachel's response without judging Raines's provocation, and you could not judge Raines's provocation without judging the 40 years of behavior that had made him believe he could raise his hand to a woman in front of 300 witnesses and face no consequences. The world was watching. Rachel was not. She was running. 10 miles in the Virginia morning, breath fogging in the October air, boots hitting pavement in a rhythm that had been her heartbeat since she was 14. She ran past the cemetery where soldiers are buried in rows so straight they look like someone measured the distance between the headstones with a ruler. She did not look at them. She kept her eyes on the road. She kept her breathing steady. She kept running because running was the only thing she had ever done that did not require permission from anyone, that did not depend on anyone's approval or anyone's stars or anyone's opinion about what a woman could or could not be. The trial was 2 weeks away. She was ready. She had been ready since she was 14 years old. The courtroom at Joint Base Meier-Henderson Hall smelled like every courtroom in every military installation Rachel had ever been in, floor polish and recycled air and the faint chemical ghost of whatever they used to clean the wooden benches. It was a room designed for gravity. High ceilings, flags behind the judge's bench, American and military, hanging with the particular stillness of fabric that is never allowed to wrinkle. Everything in a room was meant to communicate seriousness, permanence, consequence. Rachel sat at the defense table and felt the wood grain under her fingertips and thought about the floor of her apartment, about pressing her palms into it while her mother's voice came through the phone, and she wondered if she would always associate wood grain with the moments when her life was being rearranged by forces larger than herself. Chen sat beside her, folders arranged in a geometry that reflected her legal mind, precise and deliberate, and ordered in a way that Rachel recognized because it was the same way she organized her gear before a mission. Everything in its place. Nothing wasted. No excess. Across the aisle, General Raines sat with his civilian attorney Marsh and a uniformed legal advisor who looked like he would rather be anywhere else on earth. Raines was wearing his dress uniform, medals arranged across his chest in rows that told the story of a career spanning 4 decades. He looked distinguished. He looked like a man who belonged in uniform the way oak trees belong in forests, as if the uniform had grown around him rather than been put on. He did not look at Rachel. He had not looked at her since the incident. He looked straight ahead at the judge's bench with an expression of controlled patience that Rachel recognized as performance. The same performance he had been giving his entire career, the performance of a man who believes his own myth so completely that the myth has replaced whatever person used to live underneath it. Colonel Price entered. The courtroom rose. The trial began. The prosecution went first, presenting the case against Rachel. The military prosecutor was a major named Daniels who had the trim efficiency of a man who ran triathlons and organized his sock drawer by color. He laid out the charges. Assault on a superior officer. He presented the facts as he understood them, or as he had been instructed to present them, which were that Petty Officer Coulter had struck a 3-star general with sufficient force to send him to the ground, that this constituted a clear violation of the UCMJ, and that regardless of any provocation, the military chain of command could not function if subordinates were permitted to physically attack their superiors. It was a clean argument. It had the virtue of being technically true and the limitation of being morally empty, like a mathematical proof that arrives at the correct answer by ignoring all the variables that matter. Chen's opening was different. She stood and walked to the center of the courtroom with the unhurried confidence of someone who has a story to tell and knows that the story is stronger than anything the opposition can build around it. She did not raise her voice. She did not gesture. She spoke. Petty Officer Rachel Coulter is one of the first women to earn the Navy SEAL Trident. She completed BUD/S. She completed advanced training. She has deployed and operated in combat conditions. She has done everything that has been asked of her and more, and she has done it while carrying the additional weight of being told every single day by people who have never met her and have no idea what she is capable of, that she does not belong. She paused. The courtroom was still. On August 14th of this year, General Arthur Raines struck Petty Officer Coulter in the face with an open hand. He did this in front of approximately 300 military personnel from 6 nations. He did this after delivering a speech in which he questioned her right to exist in the role she had earned. He did this because she stated a verifiable fact about her own performance. And he did this because in 40 years of military service, no one has ever told him he could not. She turned to face the panel, the military equivalent of a jury, 8 officers of varying ranks who had been selected through a process that was supposed to be impartial and was at least trying to be. The prosecution would like you to believe that what happened in that courtyard was a subordinate attacking a superior. I'm going to show you that what happened was a woman defending herself against a man who believed his rank gave him the right to put his hands on her. And I'm going to show you that this was not the first time he did it. It was simply the first time someone hit back. The trial unfolded over 11 days. 11 days of testimony and evidence and the slow, grinding process of truth being extracted from a system that was built to process it, but not always built to welcome it. The prosecution called its witnesses military police officers who had responded to the incident, the base medical officer who had examined Raines, a chain of command expert who testified about the importance of military discipline and the consequences of subordinates physically confronting superiors. Each witness said true things. Each witness told a story that was accurate in its pieces and dishonest in its assembly, like a jigsaw puzzle put together from the right pieces, but in the wrong picture. Chun cross-examined with the surgical precision of someone who understands that the most devastating question is not the one that attacks the witness, but the one that forces the witness to complete their own incomplete story. You examined General Raines after the incident, she said to the medical officer. Did you also examine Petty Officer Coulter? I did not. Why not? I was directed to examine General Raines. By whom? By the general's aide, Major Holt. Did you observe any injuries on Petty Officer Coulter when you arrived at the scene? I observed a contusion on her left cheek and what appeared to be a laceration on her lower lip. Did anyone direct you to document those injuries? No. Did you document them? No. So the man who threw the first punch was immediately examined and treated, and the woman who was struck was not. Is that accurate? Objection, Daniels said. Characterization. Sustained on the characterization, Price said. But the witness will answer the factual question. Yes, the medical officer said. General Rains was examined. Petty Officer Coulter was not. She didn't let that answer sit in the room. She let it breathe. She understood something that most lawyers learn too late, that silence after a damning statement does more work than any follow-up question. The defense witnesses began on day 4. Walsh took the stand. He was in his dress uniform, which he wore with the discomfort of a man who preferred body armor. He described the training exercise. He described Rachel's performance. He described Rains's speech and the approach and the slap and the response, each element delivered with the factual precision of an after-action report. In your assessment as her team leader, Chin asked, did Petty Officer Coulter's response constitute an attack on General Rains? No. What would you characterize it as? A defensive response to a physical assault, consistent with her training. Could you elaborate? Walsh looked at the panel. SEAL operators are trained to respond to physical threats with immediate, proportionate force. When someone strikes you, your body responds. That is the training. Petty Officer Coulter did not pursue General Rains after he went down. She did not strike him again. She stopped. She identified herself. She waited for military police. That is not the behavior of an aggressor. That is the behavior of a professional who was attacked and defended herself. Marsh's cross-examination of Walsh was aggressive. He challenged Walsh's objectivity. He suggested that Walsh's loyalty to his team member was clouding his assessment. He implied that the SEAL community had a culture of protecting its own at the expense of truth. Walsh handled it the way he handled everything, with the unflappable calm of a man who has been shot at by people who were trying to kill him, and found the experience to be a useful baseline for evaluating all subsequent stressors. Marsh was not shooting at him. Marsh was asking questions. Walsh had survived worse. Senior Chief Walsh, Marsh said, are you suggesting that a petty officer has the right to strike a 3-star general under any circumstances? I am suggesting, Walsh said, that every human being has the right to defend themselves when they are physically assaulted, regardless of rank. Even in the military, especially in the military, because in the military, we are supposed to be held to a higher standard, not a standard that excuses assault based on a number of stars on someone's collar. The panel was listening. Rachel could see it in their faces, the gradual shift from the careful neutrality they had arrived with to something else, something that was not yet judgment, but was the precursor to it, the slow accumulation of evidence and testimony reaching the tipping point where reasonable people begin to form conclusions they cannot undo. Rachel took the stand on day 7. She wore her dress uniform. Her trident was pinned to her chest. The bruise on her cheek had faded weeks ago, but the photographs were in evidence, and everyone in the room had seen them. The purple-yellow bloom across her face that documented the moment a 3-star general decided that the appropriate response to a woman stating a fact was to hit her. Chen's direct examination was methodical. She walked Rachel through her background. Ridgecrest, her father, the decision at 14, the training, boot camp, the years of preparation, Bud/S, Hell Week, the trident. Each piece of the story laid down like bricks in a wall, building something that the panel could stand behind or push against, but could not ignore. Tell us about the day of the incident, Chun said. Rachel spoke. She described the exercise, the breach, her team's performance, the after-action review, Rains's speech, the approach, the accusation that she had been carried through the exercise, her response, his response to her response. He struck me across the face with his open hand, Rachel said. Her voice was steady, not flat. Steady. There's a difference. Flat means empty. Steady means full but controlled, like a river that has been channeled, but has not lost any of its force. What happened after he struck you? I responded with a palm strike to his sternum. Why? Because he hit me. The simplicity of the answer filled the courtroom. It was the kind of answer that does not need elaboration because elaboration would diminish it. He hit me. I hit back. The oldest equation in the world, stripped of politics and gender and rank and reduced to the fundamental physics of cause and effect. Did you intend to injure General Rains? I intended to stop him from hitting me again. Did you pursue him after he fell? No. What did you do? I stood there. I identified myself. I waited. Why did you identify yourself? Rachel paused. It was the first pause in her testimony. She looked at the panel. She looked at them the way she had looked at every challenge in her life, directly, without flinching, without the performance of emotion or the suppression of it. Because he needed to know who I was, she said. Not a publicity stunt. Not an experiment. Not a box someone checked. A Navy SEAL. The courtroom was quiet. Marsh's cross-examination was everything Rachel had expected. He came at her from every angle. He questioned her composure. He suggested she had been looking for a confrontation. He implied that her entire career had been a political exercise designed to prove a point rather than serve the mission. He tried to get her angry. He tried to get her emotional. He tried to get her to say something that would crack the calm she wore like armor. She did not crack. Petty Officer Coulter, would you agree that General Rains has 40 years of distinguished military service? I would agree that he has 40 years of military service. Distinguished is not for me to assess. Are you questioning his record? I am answering your question precisely. His service record is a matter of documentation. The word distinguished is a judgment. I am not in a position to make that judgment. Marsh shifted. You struck a general officer. Do you understand the gravity of that? I understand the gravity of being struck by a general officer. Yes. That is not what I asked. It is the question that matters. Marsh looked at the judge. Price looked at Marsh. Marsh moved on. He tried a different approach. You have said that you were one of the first women to complete the SEAL pipeline. Is it possible that the pressure of being in that position, the media attention, the scrutiny, affected your judgment in that moment? No. You are certain. I have operated in combat conditions under fire from people who were trying to end my life. I did not lose my judgment then. I did not lose it when a man hit me. So your training kicked in. Your combat training against a 61-year-old man in a courtyard. My training to respond to a physical threat kicked in. Yes, that training does not evaluate the age or rank of the threat. It evaluates the threat. Marsh sat down. He had the look of a man who has been trying to find a crack in a wall and has discovered that the wall is not a wall at all, but the side of a mountain, and mountains do not crack. They weather. The trial's most devastating testimony came on day 9, when the prior complaints against Rains were presented. Thomas Brewer took the stand and described being shoved into a wall. Jessica Torres took the stand and described being grabbed hard enough to leave bruises. A written statement from a third complainant was read into the record, describing verbal abuse so consistent and so sustained that it constituted a pattern of behavior spanning 2 decades. Marsh objected to each of these. Price overruled each objection. The evidence came in. It came in like water through a dam, not all at once, but in a steady flow that could not be stopped once it started. And the dam was Rains's 40-year career, and the water was the truth of what that career had contained underneath the medals and the commissions and the word distinguished. Rains himself took the stand on day 10. He was composed, articulate, commanding. He presented his version of events with the confidence of a man who has spent his entire life being believed. He described Rachel as insubordinate. He described the slap as a corrective measure taken in the heat of a confrontation that she had initiated. He expressed regret that the situation had escalated. He used the word regret 3 times. He did not use the word sorry. Chen's cross-examination of Rains was the moment the trial pivoted. She did not attack him. She asked him questions. Simple questions. The kind of questions that seem innocuous until the answers start building a structure that the witness cannot escape. General Rains, you have stated that Petty Officer Coulter was insubordinate during the after-action review. She was. What specifically did she say that constituted insubordination? She contradicted my assessment of the exercise in front of coalition personnel. Your assessment was that she had been carried through the breach by her teammates. Is that correct? That was my assessment, yes. The after-action footage shows Petty Officer Coulter as the first person through the breach point. Have you reviewed that footage? A pause. The first pause Rains had taken. It was small, half a second. But in a courtroom, half a second is an eternity. I have. And, having reviewed the footage, do you maintain that your assessment was accurate? Another pause. Longer this time. The footage shows one angle. The tactical reality is more complex than a single camera angle can capture. Is that a yes or a no, General? It is an explanation. I did not ask for an explanation. I asked whether your assessment that Petty Officer Coulter was carried through the breach was accurate, given the footage that shows her entering first. Rains's jaw tightened. It was a small movement, the kind that most people would not notice. Rachel noticed. She had been reading the faces of men who did not want her where she was for her entire adult life. It is possible, Rains said, that my assessment was incomplete. Incomplete, Chen repeated. She let the word sit. And based on this incomplete assessment, you confronted Petty Officer Coulter in front of dozens of personnel and accused her of being carried through the exercise. I spoke with her about her performance. And when she corrected your incomplete assessment by stating that she was first through the breach, which the footage confirms, you characterized that as insubordination. She was contradicting a superior officer. She was stating a fact. In the military, how you state facts matters. And in the military, General, does how you strike subordinates also matter? Marsh objected. Price sustained, but the question had already done its work. It was in the air. It was in the panel's minds. It was in the record. Chen continued. She walked Rains through each of the prior complaints. She did not accuse. She asked. She let him respond. She let his responses reveal the pattern that his words were trying to conceal, the pattern of a man who uses authority as a license, and his rank as a weapon, and who had done so for so long that he no longer recognized the difference between power and violence. You shoved Captain Brewer into a wall in 2008. That was a training incident. It was handled at the time. It was handled by being buried. Captain Brewer's report disappeared. I have no knowledge of that. You grabbed Lieutenant Torres's arm hard enough to leave bruises in 2012. Lieutenant Torres and I had a disagreement. I may have been too forceful. I regret that. You regret it. Did you apologize to her? I do not recall. She recalls. She recalls that you did not. Rain sat straight. His metals glinted under the courtroom lights. He was still distinguished. He was still commanding. He was still everything his career had built him to be. But the structure was showing cracks now, the way buildings show cracks before they fall, not in the walls, but in the foundation, in the parts you cannot see until the weight above them becomes too much. General Rains, Chen said, in 40 years of military service, have you ever struck a subordinate? The courtroom held its breath. I have used physical correction in training environments where I deemed it appropriate. Physical correction. Is that what you call striking Petty Officer Coulter across the face? That situation was different. How was it different? She was being openly defiant in front of coalition partners. She was stating a fact that you did not want to hear. And your response was to hit her. In front of 300 people. Is that what you call physical correction, General? I call it maintaining discipline. And the 7 people who have filed complaints against you over 23 years. Were you maintaining discipline with them as well? Marsh objected. Price overruled. Rains did not answer. He did not need to. His silence was the answer, and it was louder than anything he had said in 40 years of speeches. The closing arguments came on day 11. Daniels argued for conviction on the assault charge, maintaining that regardless of provocation, the military hierarchy must be preserved. It was a thin argument, and he knew it, and the panel knew it, but he made it because it was his job and because the system required someone to make it. Chen's closing was the distillation of everything the trial had revealed, not just about this incident, but about the system that had produced it. She spoke for 40 minutes. She did not raise her voice once. This case is not about whether Petty Officer Coulter struck General Rains, she said. She did. That is not in dispute. This case is about whether a woman who has earned her place in the most elite fighting force in the world has the right to defend herself when a man with 3 stars on his shoulder decides that her face is an acceptable target for his displeasure. She paused. The answer is yes. The answer has always been yes. The answer should never have been in question. She turned to the panel. Petty Officer Coulter did not ask to be a symbol. She asked to be a SEAL. She earned it. She proved it. And when a man who could not accept that reality chose to express his rejection with his hand, she responded the way every SEAL is trained to respond to a physical threat. She stopped it. She looked at Rains. For the first time in the trial, she looked directly at him. General Rains has 40 years of service. He also has 40 years of unchecked authority and 7 people who tried to tell someone what he was doing and were ignored. Rachel Coulter was the first person who could not be ignored. Not because she struck back, because 300 people watched her do it, and this time, the cameras were rolling. She turned back to the panel. Find her not guilty. Not because she is a woman. Not because she is a symbol. Because she was assaulted, and she defended herself, and that is a right that no rank can take away. The panel deliberated for 6 hours. Rachel sat in a room adjacent to the courtroom, her hands on the table, feeling the wood grain. Chun sat beside her, reviewing notes she did not need to review, because the case was out of their hands now, and reviewing notes was what lawyers do when they cannot do anything else. Walsh was in the hallway. Several of Rachel's teammates were in the building. Her mother had flown in from California and was sitting in the courtroom gallery in a dress she had bought for the occasion, the first new dress she had purchased in years. The panel returned. Rachel stood. The courtroom rose with her. Colonel Price read the verdicts. On the charge of assault on a superior officer, not guilty. On the charge of conduct unbecoming, not guilty. Rachel did not move. She did not breathe. She stood there and absorbed the words the way she absorbed everything, with the total body stillness of a woman who has been trained to hold position under conditions that would break most people. Chin's hand found her forearm onto the table. A brief squeeze. That was all. The verdict on Rains came from a separate proceeding that had run simultaneously. On the charge of assault, guilty. On the charge of conduct unbecoming an officer, guilty. On the charge of abuse of authority, guilty. Rains sat in his chair. His posture did not change. His expression did not change. He maintained the performance until the very end, the mask of command that had been his face for so long that removing it would have required surgery. But his hands, flat on the table in front of him, trembled. A small tremor, visible only if you were watching closely. Rachel was watching closely. The sentencing followed. Rains was stripped of 1 star, reduced in rank, and given a formal reprimand that would be permanently attached to his service record. He was forced into immediate retirement. His benefits were reduced. His legacy, the one that had been printed on commendation letters and spoken about at dinner parties and carved into the mythology of a family that believed authority was inherited like a surname, was rewritten in a single afternoon. It was not enough. Rachel knew it was not enough. 7 people's complaints, 23 years of behavior, and the consequence was a reduction in rank and a forced retirement with reduced benefits. He would go home to Virginia. He would live in his house with the framed commissions on the walls. He would eat dinner at his table and sleep in his bed and exist in the world as a man who had been punished but not destroyed, which was more than he had given to the people he had hurt, but less than justice requires. Rachel knew this. She accepted it. She accepted it the way she accepted cold water and desert heat and the weight of 300 gazes. She accepted it because acceptance was not the same as approval, and because the fight was never about punishing one man. It was about being the first person through the breach. It was about standing where she had earned the right to stand and refusing to move when someone tried to push her out. She walked out of the courtroom into the Virginia afternoon. October light, gold and thin, the kind of light that makes everything look like it is being remembered rather than experienced. Her mother was waiting in the hallway. Walsh was there. Her teammates were there. Her mother reached her first. She put her arms around Rachel and held on with the fierce, trembling grip of a woman who had been holding her breath for months. Rachel held her back. She pressed her face into her mother's shoulder and breathed in the smell of laundry detergent and the faint floral perfume her mother had worn for as long as Rachel could remember. Your father, her mother whispered. I know, Rachel said. They stood there in the hallway of a military courthouse while people walked around them, and the world continued to turn, and the story that had started in a dusty town at the edge of nothing reached a moment that was not an ending, because stories like this do not end. They continue. They echo. They become part of the structure that other people's stories are built on. Rachel returned to duty. She returned to her team. She returned to the work. The media attention faded the way media attention always does, replaced by the next story, and the next outrage, and the next symbol, and Rachel was grateful for the fading because it meant she could go back to being what she had always wanted to be, which was not a headline, but an operator, not a symbol, but a seal. She deployed again. She operated again. She did the work in silence, in darkness, in the spaces between the stories that make the news and the realities that never do. In the years that followed, the case became a precedent, not just a legal precedent, though it was cited in subsequent military justice proceedings involving self-defense claims by subordinates against superiors. It became a cultural precedent, a reference point, a moment that people pointed to when the conversation about women in combat roles circled back to the same tired arguments about standards and readiness and whether women belonged. Rachel never spoke about it publicly. Not once. Not ever. She completed her service. She served with distinction. She earned commendations that she put in a box and did not look at. She mentored younger operators, both men and women, and the thing she told them most often was the simplest thing she knew. Do the work. Let the work speak. She retired after 20 years of service. She moved back to California. Not to Ridgecrest. She could not go back to Ridgecrest. She moved to a small town north of San Diego, close enough to the ocean to hear it, far enough from the base to forget it. She bought a house with a porch. She got a dog, a mutt with one ear that stood up and one that folded over, and she named him Torres, and she never explained why. She ran every morning, 5 miles, then 6, then 8. She ran the way she had always run, with the steady rhythm of a woman who had been moving forward since she was 14 years old and did not know any other direction. Her mother visited. They sat on the porch and drank coffee and watched the dog chase eagles across the yard with the unhinged joy of an animal who has no idea what it would do if it caught one. They did not talk about the trial. They did not talk about the general. They did not talk about the father and the husband who had died in a house at the edge of nothing with a letter he never sent. They talked about the weather. They talked about the dog. They talked about whether the coffee was strong enough and whether the porch needed painting and all the small, ordinary things that fill the space between the moments that define a life. One evening, as the sun was going down and the light was doing that thing it does on the California coast, turning everything gold and orange and impossible, her mother said something that Rachel carried for the rest of her life. You know what your father would have said about all of this? Rachel looked at her. What? Her mother smiled. It was a small smile, the kind that holds more sadness than happiness, but holds both, the kind that belongs to women who have buried the men they loved and raised the daughters who survived them. He would have said, "That is my girl." Rachel looked at the ocean. She looked at it for a long time. The dog came and put his head on her knee, and she rested her hand on his fur and felt the warmth of it, the simple animal warmth of a living thing choosing to be close to her. She did not cry. She never cried. But she sat on that porch with her hand on her dog and her mother beside her and the ocean in front of her, and she felt for the first time in a very long time that the weight she had been carrying since she was 14 years old had not disappeared, but had shifted, had redistributed, had settled into a place in her body where she could carry it without it crushing her. The sun went down. The light faded. The seagulls disappeared. The ocean kept moving the way it always does, relentless and indifferent and beautiful. And Rachel Coulter sat on her porch and watched it and breathed and was still. She had been first through the breach. She had always been first through the breach. And now, on the other side of everything, she could rest. Not because the fight was over. The fight was never over. There would be other women, other courtyard moments, other hands raised by other men who believed that their power was permission. There would be other bells that needed to not be rung, and other oceans that needed to be stood in at 2 in the morning, and other moments where the only choice was to hold on or let go. But Rachel had done her part. She had stood where she stood. She had said what she said. She had been who she was. And the world, for all its resistance and all its cruelty and all its insistence that she was something other than what she knew herself to be, had been forced to acknowledge that she was exactly what she claimed. A Navy SEAL. Nothing more. Nothing less. And the general who had tried to take that from her was in Virginia, in a house with framed commissions on the walls, and a career that ended not with honor, but with the sound of his own back hitting the concrete, a sound that 300 people heard and that the world would not forget. That was enough. It was not justice, but it was enough. Rachel scratched her dog behind his folded ear and finished her coffee and went inside and closed the door, and that was the end of the story, or at least the end of the part of the story that belonged to anyone other than her. The rest was hers. The morning runs and the quiet house and the ocean outside the window and the trident in a box on the shelf that she did not need to look at because it was not on the shelf. It was in her chest. It had always been in her chest, pinned there not by the Navy, but by the girl who had stood at the edge of a grave and decided to become something impossible, and then, through nothing but fury and endurance and the absolute refusal to ring the bell, had done exactly that.